Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for becoming a part of EXIP for November 2025. The motion is this House regrets the rise of gig economy. So with that being said, everyone, please don't forget to mention your POI preference before the debate, before your speeches. If it's not mentioned, we're going to assume that it's to the chat. Please do keep your camera open while you guys are speaking, if possible, in cases of stable connections. And lastly, please also don't forget to time yourself and time your opponents. We're just going to help also for the timing, but be sure to time yourself and your opponents in order to make sure that the you guys wouldn't be losing track of the time. Yeah, with that being said, with no further ado, we call on the Prime Minister to start the debate. Floor is yours. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, audible.
Sorry, I
Go
forgot
ahead
to
with
turn
it.
on my camera. Yeah, I just unmute because I probably cannot see you raising your hand because of like the Zoom thingy. Yeah, prioritizing CO over OO. Probably gonna take one after five. Starting my speech in three, two, um, one. I think in order for the debate to operate properly, I think we have to do a proper world building of what exactly the rise of gig economy looks like, right? We think there are two cases of like how exactly gig economy operates on an individual. One, there's an individual who is going to like prioritizing gigs and taking side jobs over the weekend. This was like debaters who are actually taking educators' job, for example. That is a gig. Even to the extreme cases, which is the second scenario where like gig jobs become their main sources of income. They're going to abandon their full-time jobs just for the sake of like having multiple gigs, for example, because like the what gig economy essentially offers, right? This looks like on the industry basis. This looks like, for example, like on how like there's a rise of the disruptive startup creating like in terms of like creating disruptive labor system where they were going to like basically prioritizing like gig workers over like their full-time workers and like the relationships between the sort of like between the industry and the workers in of itself is going to be established as like partners, like what happened with Gojek and Grab, for example, right? I think like the main basis of like what exactly this the main selling point of like gig economy is basically the flexibility, i.e. like you can take the gigs like whenever you like. And that's like the most satiable point that probably like the reasons why people actually taking gig economy in of itself, right? But what do they compensate for is the stability, because what we have to basically agree, because it's so much flexible, because gig economy is so flexible, they're going to it's the workload and the load of like how much you're going to get this kind of like jobs over a month, for example, we're going to differ each month, for example. So therefore like it's much more unstable in comparison to like main sort of like formal working sort of like system where like you have like standardized workload and things like that. That's like what we have to sort of like differ between gig economy and like the formal work economy, right? So I'm going to posit two things. One, why the obligation of employer to exactly fulfill the rights of workers will going to be lessened in opposition side of the house when you actually support the rise of gig economy. Second, why stability is very important for an individual, and that's why like formal work economy is much more preferable, and the rest of gig economy stops these particular preferences. One, how this going to like lessen the obligation from employer to fulfill the rights of worker. What we have to posit here is why like protections of workers' right is very important, and opposition has to have a huge chunk of cases in engaging to this. Otherwise, they were going to lose this debate. I will say that in the principle of like the regardless of like their gig workers or like their formal workers, they're actually producing the fruit of their labor, right? I.e., they're actually producing their services. They're actually offering the skills that they have, something that probably other people probably wouldn't have, for example, right? So I think that regardless of the type of like workers, whether they are actually gig workers or formal workers, they're still offering similar type of services. They're still producing so much of the labor, and they have to compensate it fairly. And that's and their rights as a worker, as a producer has to be compensated fairly and protected fairly as well. What happened is that in the gig economy, you don't have the necessity to actually protect the rights of the worker itself. One is that because it's so much flexible, like it's very flexible, and then you can just kind of like in and out of like the work anytime you want. It's very hard for the employer to actually establish such kind of rights, i.e., they cannot exactly like give the similar amount of like healthcare to another, right? When they have like different amount of like workload, they have different amount of like commitment to this particular job, because again, the flexibility is the main selling point of gig economy in of itself, right? So because they're actually the flexible nature of the gig economy, you are not fully committed to the employer, and therefore the employer does not have the obligation to actually provide such rights to you as a gig worker in of itself, right? The second mechanism that I want to posit as to why this is particularly true is because how like gig economy is viewed culturally in of itself. Notice like notice this motion is about like the disaster regret. So we have to look back into like what currently right now, and not looking back into the future, because otherwise that's like this house predicts, right? So regardless of like how this going to feud later down the line, what you have to worry about is how like gig economy is currently viewed culturally in this current rising, right? What happens is that it is not seen as a formal job, right? So the problem within like gig economy are very, very much miniaturized, right? I.e., like whenever like you have your rights as a worker being backlash, for example, people's like reaction to it as just like, oh, this is just a sort of like a weekend job in of itself. You can just kind of like get over it and just take another gig, right? So the protection of the right in of itself are also like being seen as a miniature problem within the perspective of societies. Thirdly, is that there's also a pressure in of itself, right? I.e., that the instability nature of itself is also being fabricated by the algorithm. I.e., that if you actually don't take so much job, for example, the algorithm will shut you down. This is what happened in like Grab and Gojek and so on and so forth, right? So therefore, like you need to take a huge amount of like gig, for example, but then at the same time, the workers are not the employers are not obligated to actually offer you the same or like the similar proportionate amount of
Yeah,
protection to you to your work, right? Before that, yes.
is permanent jobs and contract jobs is different in yourself the house, or is contract jobs is preferred as gig economy in yourself the house?
I think I already explained to you the difference between gig workers and formal workers, and the rest of gig economy creates a lesson situations toward like formal workers in of itself. So why the formal workers is actually need to be much more stable, right? What happened is that within like former workers, there is a standard obligation for employers to actually provide such protection, because you have a standardized workload that the workers have to fulfill. So therefore, like they have to be constantly goes into office, for example. So that's why in parallel, the employers have the obligation to actually protect them, right? So therefore, like the rights are being more protected in outside the house. Second, it kills the momentum of workers' strike. We see how like right now there's a rising momentum of protection of workers' strike. We see there's a rising right of like free healthcare towards workers. We see the rise of like paternal leave and maternal leave. These are the things that currently are rising. And when you actually support the rest of the economy, you basically stops this kind of like momentum, right? Because like if you want to demand those kind of like paternal leave to like gigs workers, they're just going to like brush it off and say that, oh yeah, they're just gig workers. We don't have the obligation to provide such rights, right? So I think that in comparison, in our counterfactual, when we don't support the gig economy and we support the rest of like formal workers, I think we can push more this kind of like momentum of like this workers' right more protected, and this is something that's important because that is the nature of like the fruit of the labor in of itself. Very proud to propose.
Thank you so much for that speech, Prime Minister. To open the case of bench as a whole, we call on the layer of op. Floor is yours. Here.
Check. Is my voice audible and am I visible?
Yes, audible and visible.
Okay. Your preference, I think. Yeah, unmute aja. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm just going to go straight to the response on, basically on a whole government's case. They say that, most likely or not, gig economy gives better incentive. Formal jobs gives better incentives like healthcare and so on and so forth. Number one, I do think either way, regardless whether or not there is a rise of gig economy, formal jobs will still be there. at the end of the day, which means there will always be incentive in order to gain more incentives like, maternal leave and so on and so forth, right? Insofar that it is still considered something that is very important for those who still lives within formal work environments and so on and so forth. But here's the thing. If you are someone who is constantly working in a gig economy in order to provide yourself, you don't need those kind of incentives to begin with, right? Because if, for example, you are pushed towards an unrealistic deadline, for example, or along those lines, you can easily opt out of those kind of gig jobs and so on and so forth, and look for other clients that give better pay, for example, they give better leeway, or give better deadlines and so on and so forth. Note that why things like incentive is so important in a formal workplace, exactly because you are forced to do things because you are unable to opt out of that. Hence, you are given incentives in order so you won't flee and so on and so forth. This is why even in a world where most individuals works in a gig economy, it's totally okay, even if they do not get incentives like maternal leave and so on and so forth, insofar that they can just opt out of that. But more than that, I think this is why gig economy is very important, right? Because it gives you the flexibility to take jobs whether or not you are able to work those jobs. For example, things like when you are having a baby and you are currently pregnant, you can just lessen your workflow. Or if you are sick, you can also lessen your workload and so on and so forth. You have the flexibility to do that. Hence, we say these incentives that are being pushed by government is not important in a world where, gig economy, in a world where there is a rise of gig economy. But I'm going to bring two things on my arguments. Firstly, I'd argue why then this is important for people who wants to transition to begin with, right? Because here's the thing. Ever since the whole thing about COVID and so on and so forth, how it pushes towards more digital transactions, for example, how it pushes for more remote working jobs and so on and so forth, like virtual assistant and so on and so forth. This leads to, how most individuals and how most companies, try to do their work jobs. This leads to things like, work from homes and so on and so forth. How then this is very important in the context where how then gig economy is important in the context where people are more digitally inclined to begin with? I think it's very simple because the products that are being created by these gig economies are since it is new, it is sometimes underappreciated in where you live. This is, for example, not everybody can appreciate things like digital designs, poster designs and so on and so forth. Like, arts, creating digital designs, creating digital arts and so on and so forth. This is why if you are a student or you are a fresh graduate that have those capabilities, it is very hard for you to find a job within the context that these kind of things are underappreciated to begin with, especially, for example, in third world nations and so on and so forth. This is why you need to be able to import those kind of digital designs to begin with, right? You need to be able to cater towards a global market where most likely, your products are more appreciated. Your products are more appreciated and whatnot. But whether it is still likely for you to be able to compete as a fresh graduate in this global market, I think it's simple because if you look like, for example, you come from a third world country, I think you are able to sell these things in a more cheaper way because you don't need as much money in order to survive your life, in where you live, for example, and so on and so forth. Therefore, you will have the ability, to create a market segmentation for the things that you want to create, and that you want to create at the end of the day. This is why, at the end of the day, we are able to continue the digital transaction and the digital transition that exists in status quo. Therefore, we are more connected to our status quo. But the second thing that I want to talk about is we're going to trade off the stability that government tries to champion. I think I do agree that gig economy is easier for you to be able to opt in and opt out of these jobs. It is less stable. We do agree with that in our open opposition. But here's the trade-off. Number one, I don't think they have ever explained to why the instability exists under their side of the house and so far. Things like, massive layoffs happen either way and keep happening. Especially post-COVID, there are many companies shutting down and, have massive layoffs, and then they rebuild the company once again, and so on and so forth and whatnot, right? Either way, stability does not exist post-COVID. But here's the thing: the benefit that exists in open opposition is that there's way more chances for people to learn if you operate within a gig economy. Because note that you have way more learning exposure, you can opt in towards different kind of jobs and learn those different kind of jobs. Why it is very important? Because note that the trend that exists in status quo, things like, there's many boot camps like coding, creating digital designs, data analysts, and so on and so forth. But it's note that these kind of trends is very hard to implement without the rest of gig economy, because what you only get is things like theory and so on and so forth, but you don't have anywhere to practice it to begin with, right? Therefore, you need the gig economy in order for these kind of boot camps that exist in such school to be able to lead towards fruition. But whether exposure is
Yeah.
more important, simply because in the long term, because if you're a fresh graduate and you seek for permanent jobs, first things first, it will be very hard for you to be able to opt out. You might not like those jobs, for example, as someone who works in law, you might not like being a lawyer, but and you want to seek other passion. But it's very hard for you to be able to opt out because you are stuck with that. Basically, what government said, it is too permanent. It's hard for you to find other jobs. If there's no rise of gig economies, there is less option to begin with, right? This is why we should support the rise. Because if we not support the rise and gig economy only existed, the options would be very limited. It is hard for you to look for other jobs, to look for more exposure and whatnot, right? It is important for you to be able to learn more things, exactly because either way, stability does not exist in both sides of the house. Hence, you need to be able to have the ability to, implement the boot camps that I tried to explain before. Hence, it is exclusive, because without the gig economy, you have nowhere to practice it. You can practice your coding and whatnot. Hence, you need to be able, to learn more things in the gig economy. Never been prouder. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that speech. Leader of UP, to close the case of opening government. We call on the DPM. Floor is yours. Here.
Here. Audible, clear?
Audible and clear on my end.
All right. Just unmute directly for POR. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Every economic system essentially has to answer one simple problem. How do you make sure that the people who want to work, right, who wants a salary for the labor perform, are matched with the people with capital who wants those work perform for them? I think this is the essence of the rise of the gig economy system, right? Because the theory is very simple. If you allow literally every single eligible person with a car, for instance, to potentially become a taxi driver who sells their service through an app that is used by everyone in a given city, then you're going to have this massive market efficiency. Competition is going to drive prices down, but the convenience will also mean more consumers are going to spend money because getting a taxi is easier now, thus driving growth in that sector. That growth is going to mean more people getting employed, thus solving problems like a saturated job market where no one can land a position because the process of job matching under traditional employment is too inefficient. I think this is the intuitive case from opposition. I don't know why O didn't bring it. Let's hope CO brings that. But then again, I'm going to tear this down because 3 reasons why this is a hoax. This has not been the case and we should regret it. First, consider the fundamental way by which the rise of gig economies has altered the way we culturally view the relationship between employer, worker, and consumer, right? LO wants to say that formal jobs will still exist, but I think they fundamentally makes mistake if they think that those formal jobs are also not affected by this, right? Because let me illustrate why this is not the case. If you work in a lot of blue-collar sectors, say transportation, say things like graphic design, then a lot of the market now relies on these gig economic platforms, right? Like you cannot just walk into Bluebird, get an interview, sign a contract that you will own a Toyota Corolla in 50 years, and then that's it. That's the rest of your life. Because now everyone is sort of like, everyone expects to get the same services from a gig economy platform. Because again, they are a lot more efficient. This is something that opposition can really capitalize on. It is going to match a lot of these workers who can get you from point A to point B a lot faster than a traditional employment method, right? But now you kind of don't have an option if you exist in these spaces. But they say, well, there will still be incentives for you to like just opt out of these things and whatnot, right? But here's also the thing, because now, because the cultural expectation is for you to be a lot more flexible, you are also expected to say, well, if you don't get healthcare from this company, just look for more gig jobs to like cover up the fact that this one specific employer doesn't provide that. After all, it's a gig economy. You have this extra flexibility, right? I think it's fair for you to also get less, and this devalues the value of their labor, right? Because now, for instance, instead of people being able to say, well, what if I work in an office job, but also wants a long maternal or paternal leave, they are going to say, well, then an office job is not a good fit for you. Go get a gig job instead. It's a lot more flexible. See, because the gig economy is now the dominant form by which society matches these two, the worker who provides the service and the customer who pays for the service. Now, you also fundamentally make it harder for people to say, well, we deserve these things, because they're going to say there is a lot of flexibility in the market, right? And here's the thing: under a perfect world in which laborers and employers have equal power in the ability to negotiate, to bargain with each other, I think this might be able to work. Unfortunately, the world in which we found ourselves is not like this, because, well, how do you actually manage like having literally every single available laborer in a pool be matched with customers? Algorithms, right? This is what makes companies like Uber, like Gojek, like Foodora, like Fiverr, and things like that. Because now, you make these workers compete against each other instead of like firms competing on the basis of reputation, on the basis of like their previous contracts, etc. Labor is a lot more alienated, because I think when you actually order something from the gig market, you don't really necessarily care who performs this labor, as long as it's like within a specific budget and timeline, right? And this is really bad, because now you as the laborer have so much less ability to say, well, I don't want to do this, like, right? If think about all of those Gojek drivers who cannot reject an order, even if it means like they have to drive really really far to the pickup point, because, well, that's gonna ding their rating in the sorting algorithm, and that's gonna like ruin the rest of their work. Because again, in a gig economy, you are competing with literally every single available laborer, versus under a traditional employment model, because where, well, yes, it's a lot less convenient and it's a lot less efficient, but it's also a lot more stable. You kinda put a cap on the amount of laborers that is able to provide the service in a given area. That means, like, they will absorb the demand, they have more bargaining rights and things like that. Second, I think this also dampens the momentum for labor unions. Sure.
Can you prove to us why welfare benefit becomes somewhat a correct thing that is always going to happen inside the house?
I think it's a lot more important than catering for fresh graduates, at least, because welfare benefits kind of affect literally all workers, regardless of whether or not you opt into the gig economy. Because I have proven to you that, the labor movement overall is weakened by this rise, right? Because instead of arguing what rights you need to have as a worker, right? How much you should be compensated, how much healthcare benefits or day off you should be entitled to, you are arguing about whether or not you are a worker at all who are owed by these companies, right? Because now you're a community partner or whatever. And that's the thing about the gig economy. It kind of devalues you as a worker into the services alone, because the services alone are what counts in a gig economy, versus this entire idea of a worker who kind of like opts into an industry, opts into a company, and sort of like grows through that position. And this is also not just bad for the worker, it's also really bad for the companies. Think about WeWork, about all of these major disruptive innovative startups that like starts with a bang, burns a lot of capital, and then just collapses 3-4 years later. Why? Because that lack of imagination. Because now when you devalue people and their work into just how much service they are able to provide you, you have so much less incentive to actually invest in people, to actually let them grow into their position and actually like develop a lot of these skill sets. Because I think the fundamental flaw of the case coming from opening opposition is that they kind of assume the kind of compensation, salary, experience, and benefits that you can get from all of this like more stable positions where you do develop a lot more value for the company, because you have stayed there for a longer time, you have all of this industry and institutional knowledge that you can pass down, etc., is going to be symmetrical with what you can get from a gig economy. I don't think this is true. And insofar as we can prove that this rise has managed to make this inaccessible for people in so many sectors, and just so much happens so much less to the point where a lot of companies go bankrupt because they cannot access this, I think we have proven to you that you should regret this rise.
Thank you so much for that speech, DPM. To close the entire opening half, we call on the DLO. Floor is yours. Here.
Hi, check, I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. POI preference through chat, gender preference he or him, prioritizing CG. Okay, I'm going to start my speech in. Wait. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. If there is one similarity between the companies that exist under the current status quo and teenagers, is that they have both a commitment issue. But the differences is, in Arts of the House, the mono it talks about economy. The cases of commitment issues that exist in the current company, there is no such thing as the government could do to prevent those kind of stuffs. Why so? Because currently the biggest problem that Kuku already provided in this debate is talking about how the rising of the recent growth of economy, especially after COVID, seeing about how economical development becomes somewhat of a hard stuff, seeing about how the more people you have, the more labor you have, is actually a bigger burden towards this kind of company. Hence, the moment of instability exists at the end of the day, these kind of companies are more likely to collapse at the end of the day. This is why companies have a harder kind of mechanization for them to actually achieve these kind of permanent workers under the current status quo. Seeing about how like the precedent of cases that happens in the future, in the past, right? Hence, still becomes the question until the end of the day. How do people could actually achieve a certain kind of job fields if companies are reluctant to actually uh, hire this kind of worker? This is why the rising of gig economy becomes somewhat of an alternative that solve this kind of problem. Because until the end of the day, the fear that exists in this debate is people still need jobs, people still need works. What the government doesn't explain to you is, this is why my POI, both towards Dio or uh, towards OG becomes somewhat of an important POI. How, in their side of the house, people are going to be accepted to become a permanent employee, and about how the welfare benefit is going to work. Because the prerequisite towards the benefit of stability in the cases of government to actually works is first, people, this kind of worker, regardless what how they are old people or fresh graduate people, the prerequisite towards all of these kind of welfare benefits, stability, etc., to actually happens is they need to be accepted towards becoming a permanent employee in the first place, right? We already proved to you that becoming a permanent employee is somewhat of a privilege that exists under the current status quo, where not every people could achieve those kind of stuff. Hence, we question how the benefit in the government stuff, the house talking about stability could happen. What is the alternative in the cases of opposition? We prove to you that because about how this kind of commitment issue that exists in the government and in the companies, that but at the same time they still need workers. That's why the alternative that they wanted to do is doing this kind of outsourcing. This is why gig economy becomes somewhat a solution, where when people actually need jobs, right? The easiest way for them to actually communicate and obtain this kind of job fields opportunity in the beginning is coming from this kind of gig economy. This is why we say, for example, if you doesn't have any more choices, but you could actually drive a car or you could actually drive a bike, you could become a driver at the end of the day, where the harder you work, the more money you get. Rather than the moment we compare it with the cases of government, assuming the best case scenario you somewhat become of what a permanent employee at the end of the day, we question why the capitalistic system that exists in the governments of the house, which forces you to work as hard as you can, but doesn't really care. The harder you work, you doesn't get more money. That the moment that you lack off, you're going to be laid off from this kind of company. In ours of the house, the incentive to improving economy actually exists because about how the concept of gig economy in the first place shows. The harder you work, that means the more gig of debating jobs you take at the weekend, which means the more money you get every month, about how there are more capital that you could gain at the end of the day. Hence, we question under the first clashes talking about which side of the house could prove to you how their kind of benefit could actually work in sense of why people could get their job, why people have the capital to fulfill their needs, and why people get their kind of opportunity coming from the beginning is only acceptable in the cases of opposition. The moment we prove to you that the reason why companies doesn't cater towards this kind of stuff under the current status quo is not because they doesn't want to, but because they also thinks about the risk that is happening, especially the moment we look at the past, people about how the instability of economy, what if another kind of pandemic actually happens. That's why this kind of company becomes more, yeah, they basically try to play it more safe, right? The rising of gig economy actually gave this kind of opportunity towards this kind of people. Sure, the welfare benefit is not going to be as good as what the government tried to propose. But at the very least, we prove to you why this kind of people could actually have a chance to provide for themselves. But before that, yes, CG.
Wouldn't make that gig economy would be highly competitive if everyone done the same thing as what you thought. It means that in the end, gig isn't going to be prominent.
But that is exactly the point, right? If government want to champion talking about economical incentive in creation of better development, you need a competitive advantage, right? I don't know what is the cases of CG, but this is actually clashing towards the point of OG. Talking about how in OG, they talks about that we want to make sure people are matched. People are going to compete and about how we create betterment. They say in opposition, we're going to decrease the competitive advantage. We say no. The cases of opposition, exactly, because you want to strive, you want to be better, you need to unlock your kind of potential and become better on those kind of stuff. This is why competitive advantage is going to be sure. In government, competitive advantage will still happen. But what we question is, what is the incentive for you to actually do it, right? We say in your side of the house, the moment you regret the rise of gig economy, that is actually became the moment where you disincentivize people to work harder to what they could gain at the end of the day. In our side of the house, exactly, for example, because you know that you need the money from every weekend debate gig, eduing gig, right? That's why you still following competitions. That's why you still follow the kind of meta that's existing in the debate. You still give the incentive towards yourself to make a betterment in yourself, hence to achieve this kind of opportunity in and out itself. In the cases of government, not only the opportunity is so small, the chances, you also disincentivize people to actually make themselves better. Hence, we question first, what is the benefit towards the people? Second, what is the benefit towards this kind of economy the moment you doesn't make a competitive advantage in making a better economy? But not only that, we say in the opening opposition is the only side that is trying to cater, right? How the world under the current status quo, seeing about how gig workers become somewhat of an important job towards this kind of people. We say every alternative towards healthcare still exists outside the house, but we say the chances and the opportunity for this kind of people to actually persevere and also to develop themselves to see what kind of better option that they have exclusively exists in the cases of OO Protopos.
Thank you so much for that speech, DLO. To open the case of the closing bench, we call on the member of Gov. Floor is yours. Here.
All right, just a minute. I happily accept from chat. The basis of advantage is an incentive because you already have a degree to be trusted. You are having an internship in your previous study, or even become a member of community. They make it high chances to be accepted even without the gig economy coming from the opposition's proposal. And it's because like oppositional proposals thought that everyone seems like doesn't have any kind of ability to create any kind of proper education, for example, or perhaps there's no kind of chances for you to go into the better positions. And it's because like the chances of them are less likely happens. It is because in very basic status quo right now, most of them already have this kind of scenario, and this kind of requirement is enough to make sure everything is going to be fulfilled in the current status quo in a full-time employment, right? This is the way that we feels like opening opportunities is quite intuitive, like how opening government stated on, but try to engaging in much more better, broader picture. First, they talk about how healthcare is also going to be exist in the idea of opening positions, right? We believe it's no, because healthcare system is only came from their saving. There's no kind of certain insurance, or perhaps there's no kind of possibility for them to gain any kind of portrayal of insurance company they would like to be counting it on because it's going to be very costly. It means like healthcare system isn't going to be happen. Second, talking about the deadline, we believe that deadline are totally symmetric because it could overwork from both sides. But our side, at least overwork only happen in one position when you have a rather competitions in the gig. Because in the gig, it will force you to do a lot of things like multitasking in different positions. You are judging on the weekend, but you're accountant in the full time, and at night you are becoming driver of Gojek. It means that you totally overwork your situations, and it's totally not even worth it. And it's the gig positions opening this kind of situations, but he didn't care about the individual to take this kind of chances or make it feels like it's going to be overworking. Second, talking about the bootcamp or learning data class that happened on opening oppositions, right? It's still quite intuitive because sure, it improves your soft skill, but it's also highly competitive because everyone will take it. Same thing like how Stephen will talk about. Everything is going to be highly competitive. That whole gig isn't going to be a niche market in current situations, but it's open market that everyone can done it. It means that you also have the same ability to go into heavy competitions with how full-time workers in the very beginnings. It means there's nothing special. It didn't guarantee a job and going to be not available everywhere. This is the exclusivity coming from opening governments, right? In closing governments, right? Because in closing governments, we're able to cater into much bigger, broader picture in our side of the house. Because we believe that in our side of the house, we have a different thought from opening governments. Let's talk about three things we're going to talk about. First, let's talk about employment right. Because in a very basic scenario, oppositions didn't write in the stand of the well contract that already been started, right? Because there's a chances for you to get a one-sided terminations that is mainly happens in most of the oppositions, right? Furthermore, there's also going to be conflicted because the payment system isn't going to be as what you thought. Sometimes it's less paid from how full-time work is going to be happens. Their right to be upheld will gain much more insurance in government side of the house because we're not going to be happens on a contract basis. Because from the very beginning, oppositions doesn't create any kind of environment of how work will be looked like. There's no facility being provided. You're forced to use what utilization that you need to become. Where in the world of opposition, it tries to tell you that even though that economic recessions, you need a double job, for example, we believe it's not that simple due to the overwork that could happen from the full-time and freelance, even the clash of working time, that even they try to make it as full-time worker. It's totally not guaranteed in the future for you to live prosper since there's no safety in the setup of. Furthermore, in Gov world, in CG exclusively, will be world where we're going to work with a safety parameter, better environment, a world where you have your own working spaces with your partner and grow together. It's create an environment that makes you become a loyal person, especially from employment system. Because current situations, it is so hard for you to in a very basic scenario, a company would like to gain a very loyalty employments, right? Because a loyal employment only appear for you to become a full-time worker and it's exclusively going to be exist only from CG because we try to create it on without even using gig economy because gig economy only create terminations in the end. It doesn't create any kind of situations to answer the commitment issue of opening oppositions. Second, about the company regulations, talking about the preference of the using a gig economy, it will build a toxic environment. Why? Because individually will not gain a systematic situation such as like promotion, then choose to let a managerial to be exploiting this employment situations, right? This is the way that most of the time employment turnover rate has a high replacement and is frequently happen just because of gig economy. It shows that how many corporate are being totally corrupted to utilize gigs economy, and those utilizations will force you to create a limitations with one positions and it's going to be much more better wages. There's no improvement for you, only going to become a set of experiences. There's not going to be like that. Comparatively in the government world, whereas in the current status quo, it gives you a proportional process of experiences with a long-term progress, chances of promotions into higher positions. This means that it's going to be create a proper welfare for your future, a progressivity in your financial stability that only appear in the company regulations from very beginnings. Before that, yes, CEO.
You do realize that the motion rise because of dissatisfaction towards status quo economy. What's gonna rise in your side anyway? Because you cannot just claim that things just gonna go well.
Yeah, it's not going to be happen from both sides of the house because both sides have their own burden to tell you how this is going to be happening, right? In full-time worker, at least it's creates stability. It makes you have a much more prosper true, it's competitive, but that's what we like to be done. But in a gig economy, since it's a short-term contract, it doesn't create any kind of stability, which means going to be a proper invitation of the debate from the beginning. So it's weird engagement. All right, let's talk about the last one. It's a personal times. We believe that the gigs could be taken into the weekend, like OG perspective, or maybe opening opposition perspective, like. But we're missing in the scenario that we're sacrificing most of your time only to achieve target that build up that even beyond your energies, right? That's like how Stephen says, it's going to be happens only appear that gigs economy appear for like youth peoples, right? But it's total utopia because some of the people in current situations, especially in gig economy, are being taken by the old people that force themselves that even in the current situations, they are not going to be have a time for them to working, right? This is the way that we understand that the competent is exist, but remember that employments are exclusively have a starting point from very beginnings to having the abilities, right? It's also happening from both sides of the house. But at least in government world, this starting point will be much more preferable because you have your own personal time at the end of the day on the weekend without any kind of disturbance. Because when you try to do this kind of judging gigs, it means you are forcing have less economic systems. But when you have this kind of personal time, it means you have enough financial stability. It means you don't have to depending on this kind of gig force. Gig force force you to spending this kind of breaking and create a workaholic environment. Let's spend time with family that makes you disregard by the other family member or even spouse. This is the way that gig economy will create a toxic situations comparatively for a full time that make it much more structurized from very beginnings. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that speech, Member of Gov. To open the case of closing opposition, Member of Op, floor is yours. Here.
All right, POI to unmute. Prioritizing opening. This is not a this house prefer motions. I don't understand why Bench is trying to weigh the good and the permanent jobs and the bad in gig economy. This is a this house regret motion about the rise of gig economy. That's why my contributions as member of oppositions going to manifest into what's exclusive to the rise first. Three things like this. One, the accessibility of information. We're talking about how the rise process in itself. We're talking about social media gurus or people talking about jobs, career, and whatnot, talking about this, the rise of the gig economy, the options that people could choose. It's gonna be all over your pages. You're gonna have informations of this. Accessibility of information is exclusive to the rise. Second, it's going to strengthen community existence. We're talking about more interconnectors of communities. If you are talking about debating gigs, then you're talking about how Indonesia debating community could check and balance each other due to the increasement of demands of coaches and whatnot, and how could you stabilize the price of coaching fees and whatnot, because right now there is a comparisons and there's a lot of discussions talking about where do we get this gig and whatnot. But then third of all, it's going to manifest into demand for platforms, which manifests into web creations like Fiverr and so many things else, right? Now, not that this is already contributed enough to explain how then the process of job making already exists in us, at least for web developer creating those workplace recruitment platforms. But then secondly, how then this is also create more information and accessibility. We don't understand why all three benches trying to weigh in as gig economy is good or gig economy is bad. What we're trying to weigh is the rise in itself, give more people accessibility and knowledge towards the good and the bad, because right now they are being discussed. So this is exactly the accessibility of information that's going to be the one of the underlying contributions from closing a position. But then way before that, several rebuttals. Starting with OG, I think their whole premise is about how it's going to create betterment in the status quo without really providing how the counterfactual is going to look like. Because this is exactly the same POI that I asked to closing government. How then in your world, there will be something that is also rising, because the problem in itself is the one that set the motion arise. A lot of people are actually succumbing to the gig economy to the point that it become a rising trend and whatnot, shows that the capitalistic traditional companies doesn't work very well. But then if you're going to say that, oh no, we're just going to flow with it without really giving clear counterfactuals and say that, oh, you're going to fulfill the rights of workers, then you better say how then it's going to manifest. Because the only claim that coming from opening government is that, oh, there's an ongoing precedence of good things and you are going to stop the progressive program in status quo. Quite the contrary. One, we think that the companies, if they do realize that a lot of people does not want to work in their place anymore because people are opting into gig, then they will need to offer something better healthcare, better accessibility of informations and whatnot about the job, so that they could be recruiting people. Maternity leaves and that will still be there. But then exactly because of that, the goal of opening government, and also I assume it's closing government, is actually heavily reliant toward the process of having bargaining power, which could only happen when people actually have options. When people are not begging to be let in into this traditional permanent work kind of company. Because if they do know that, oh, these people are lining up at our door waiting for interviews, they have no options and whatnot, they will not do things because they don't see you as having enough bargaining power, or they don't see the protest coming from labor union that you are trying to rise is something that is important, right? This is the manifestation of option explanations coming from opening of positions, and how then we manifest this into a blatant response that actually manifests into our contributions as well.
Right.
We think that the standard obligation for employer that being talked by OG is exactly something that could only occur when these people have bargaining power and comparatives or a threat of that they could weigh on what to choose, and that's why companies are becoming more progressive. But before that, yes, point.
So you say if union demands more annual leaves to the company, then the company can just say just go gig workers.
Yeah, they could, and I don't see any problem with that. The company will be discussed in the rise of gig economy. You better choose to be debate coaches rather than opting into Big Four, because Big Four doesn't really listen to you, which actually backlash to the company, which shows that the rise in itself trigger a better discussions for a betterment of economy. I don't see why that accessibility of information is not a good thing. But then second thing that they mentions about startup and everything, we don't understand why startup is the same as gig economy. Startup that you mentioned that go bankrupt and whatnot is exactly the traditional economy trying to cater about the gig economy in itself. So we think, yeah, that's the problem of the elitist that goes bankrupt. We don't see why this is important. But then towards CG, it's just simple. You say that overwork is bad. I think if people choose to be overworked, it's their own autonomy. But then I think what's bad also is pressure of not getting permanent job, or pressures when you are screaming in front of your screen and your mother say that get a real job, and then you will not be happy because you're feeling like I'm actually doing a real job. This is more than 40 hours a week, and I get actual better payment comparatively with UMR and whatnot. But then the social pressure will still be there because gig job is not a job according to what they say. This is also the better manifestation of options, how this exists in us. I think I'm gonna manifest a little bit first about the barrier of entry and how then these issues manifest better in us. I think the most important thing that needs to be explained is that traditional job is super limited for 4 reasons. One, they are expensive. They need to rent building in SCBD, or if they're quite lesser in Jaktim probably. They doesn't have enough allocations of money to actually recruit quality of people or like sufficient number of people. This already outweigh OO contributions in challenging alternative of opening government of how then recruitment gonna work. But secondly, the need for job is huge to employ, but then the number is not sufficient. But three, long process of selections. We're talking about empty. People are left hanging for months. They actually need to live in Jakarta waiting for the interview, but not a lot of people could do this because they don't have the prerequisite money to actually do that. But then but first mover advantage, the big four companies would only accept people from top university with relationals in Lincoln and whatnot to their seniors, which mean not a lot of people could manifest into that, which manifests into two things. One, it's not accessible for many people. Two, stagnant market gonna exist in you, which manifests into even if there are good stable job, it's only small amount of people, and the contract is not gonna be moved as you claim because they don't have a comparative nor bargaining power. But then the second contribution, job opportunities. I'm not going to say that people have options and not. I'm going to say that people could live as a human. People could save career. The moment Hema decided doesn't want to work as penalty in Britain and whatnot, he could choose a career in STEM. Why? Because this is manifest into the first of gig working. But then even if it's not, I think the closure that you could get simply because this has become a normalization through the process of rising and discussion and acceptance in society. I could be screaming in my screen at, 9 in the afternoon, and then my mother wouldn't shout because my mother thinking, oh, he's actually working instead of just yapping. For those reasons here.
Thank you so much for that speech. To close the entire government bench as a whole, we call on the Gov Whip. Floor is yours. You're here.
Hi. Let me open my camera. Sorry. So pronouns he, him. POI, please submit yourself. Prefer or minute 4 or 5. I think that's all. Let me set my timer first. Okay, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. CG will assume the rise itself exists because people are tired of from the status quo, aka corporate culture, inflexible work time, bossy boss. People are tired and they want to stop being a corporate slave. I do agree with CO, and all those things are bad. But this doesn't mean that you should incentivize people to go dig itself, right? Especially when all this problem, aka bossy boss, inflexible work, exists under opposition times 100. What do you mean by this, right? Two scenario. First off, right? Scenario A, under CG, if you're a pregnant mother, you would take the maternal leave, right? And still get the income compared to opposition base, especially OO, that doesn't exist. Maternal leave doesn't exist under GIG job. You don't have the employment benefit or employment rights under those kind of law under that OO does under OO leave, right? Under this, because under OO, you're just another citizen that can be outsourced by another citizen. You're nothing towards them, right? This means you don't have any protection rights, protection worker within under status quo of opening opposition and closing opposition. Example, you don't have rights of insurance, you don't have rights of maternal leave. This means you are, if you're left alone, you are nothing, and you could die of it so easily, right? Because company doesn't have any kind of rights and company hasn't have any kind of responsibility to take care of you because you are nothing towards them and there's no written contract of you need to be taken care of from the company itself, right? But scenario B, if you have a baby itself, right, again you have your family to take care of under set opposition, and no, under opposition, under gigs anyway, you will take the 1 hour, the 10-hour words under opposition exactly because you need the money to buy your baby diaper itself, right? Rather than you trying to take, for example, 4 hour of work, you because under opposition, you will take the overwork time exactly because you need the money, you need the hours to take care of your family. Yes, we do agree that under the opposition, you have the quote-unquote option to work less and have more free time. Under those free time, you will also have less money, and under those less money, you have less capability to fulfill the needs of for yourself and your family. So this means either way, you don't have through this way under opposition you don't have any kind of quote unquote flexibility of work hour because either way if you want to fulfill your own needs you need to take the exact hour of full-time worker aka 10 hour or even plus to fulfill your family needs, right? So at all, welcome to illusion of freedom. Under opposition there's never truly a word of freedom. Under opposition, this also include of instability of hours. And either way, if you have bossy boss under opposition, your boss is now your own example, your own customer who like to boss you around, who like to complain and give you 0 star under Gojek app. That equals meaning to you don't have any work at all. And under those scenario, we don't think it's good for the worker itself, right? So this is why the House proposed under the motion of we want to people to have a full-time worker, right? So now, Judge, how do I will engage to this debate then? I will extend my case. I will extend my case with first engaging towards CO case and then towards OO then. First off, CO, right? I do agree with CO mentioning about how the debate is not solely about how gigs economy is bad, but notice how the rest of this other economy exists because of the overhype and globalization of the gig economy itself, right? AKA, what does OO mention to you that on how how bootcamp need to, in order to for bootcamp exist, there may be a rise of gig economy on how they also mentioned about the effectivity of gig economy and the efficiency and the flexibility of those kind of stuff, right? Exactly how the House try to downplay the existence of a gig economy to make sure the overhype is not that high, to make sure that people not over glorified gig economy itself, right? What do you mean by this? People not throw away their jobs, their full-time jobs in order to do gig economy for their entire work life, for the entire full solid income and under for their entire income for their family or etc. We do agree that the existence of gig economy is good, right? Because example, if you cannot get into a full-time work, maybe you can do that for a month until waiting for a more stable job. So make sure that, example, your wife can get maternal leave or you can get parental leave, so you can take care of your kids or etc. Right? Or also can benefit for your children, etc. 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 This is why the benefit of worker rights is so important. And the same proposition exactly is that because that is exactly the foundation of you being able to take care of yourself and your entire family, right? Under those contribution, what else CEO mentioned to what else that CEO mentioned? One thing, like Judge. CEO mentioned about how under the government it's going to be unlikely for us to get those benefit, aka worker benefit, exactly because of the high requirement of entry of worker to get a work into very beginning, right? Three responses. Firstly, this also exists under O, same as tabber or coach. You need to differentiate yourself towards the status quo, right? What is the difference of beginning you as a tabber and the other tabber from the other university, right? If you can differentiate yourself, or even bad, or even be a step in front of them, you're not going to be employed. The only thing you're going to have is you're not going to be employed, and yeah, you're not going to have gigs and etc. So this means understand on either way, both sides the same, right? If you don't have a job outside the house, that's it. You don't have a job. But underside opposition is still the same, right? So I don't think it's exclusive problem under this context. Before 6 minutes, is there any POI? 3, 2, 1. Second off, right? Job ability, right? But in the way, Judge, job ability will be more exist under CG. Why is that? So, right, when you play under status quo, it say like gig economy should not be the only way or should not the way of you gaining income at all, right? So this means it does motivate from people to get a permanent jobs. It does also motivate example other corporate job, other company to make more job opportunity so you get into it, right? It also motivate the government itself to open more job opportunity for its worker to its citizens. Exactly what will happen exists more under of opening government under causing government. Exactly, it can be more cater. It could be more regulated. Exactly, there's contract. There is permanent solution. There is check and balance under CG, and which is the law, which is contract a full time worker that doesn't exist under CO contracts, right? Because under CO, the only contract you have is, oh, you work under this company for this kind of per hour, but we don't care about you. This is why under open or under opposition, it's going to be hard if you really want the if we want the country or the government to take care of you, because under those contexts, the company doesn't really own you at all, right? But point C, right, Judge? So what's different then? The requirement of entry will still be high at the both sides of the house, but we have proof to you on why ability will still exist. Why is it likely for our side of the house people will get a job, right? Because internship does exist. Bootcamp does make you have easier time to get a job, right? The delta is our benefit is much more better compared to say opposition. That's why our side of the house propose. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that speech, Government Whip. To close the entire debate, we call on the up whip for yours. Here.
A quick clarification, I cannot open my camera because of network problems. For PI purposes, just unmute yourself. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. When single parents has to sustain themselves and their children, the likelihood of them seeing this rise at their way out is high. Social welfare isn't something that they can rely on. Normalization of them working multiple jobs could be an understatement, right? I think this pressure coming from themselves would eventually happen regardless. This resistance is a fit to their circumstances. At least we can cater their needs. So proud. But panels, before moving into my weighing, also a few Tim contribution. First, on terms of accessibility, and second, on terms of possibility of coexisting 9 to 5 jobs. And what is the comparison? I think on the terms of accessibility, right? To which we want to cover how the diversification of jobs and opportunity to accessibility would be a prominent case, since workers would actually consider their preferences as an option, something to pursue. To distinct our case, we brought A, information, and also B, how the integration in source would be a likelihood for these people to thrive later on. I think to which we ensure a widespread of segmentation of gigs and what is attainable, and this is very much competitive market. Another assignment we could cater, which is utilizing digital platform for profit, which is when people realize that they could do some work, they could make that and utilize that as much as possible to just get some side hustle. I think B, it is also on the terms of integration in sources, because these people can actually realize that all of these potentials cannot be going to waste. These people would actually realize that I can do this and I can get something from this. So this is very much attainable for them to just cover what all of the things that they can do, like all of the potential, they can maximize it to the fullest. I think this is also an awakening moment of and when they mention of CJ mentioned, right, about how this is an awakening of people searching that I can replace my 9 to 5 jobs with gigs. I think to which externalities happen when people actually realize that not only that this gigs would actually provide them with more profits and flexibility, I think to which they would also realize that their environment, their work environment is really, really toxic. I think like their colleagues is shitting on them, etc., etc. I think irrationality wouldn't happen because they realize their privilege to which like their stability in the very first place, right? Which is our trade-off. I think also OGs argue that this has the incentive to dehumanize workers, to which it pushes back the efforts and it focuses towards accomplishment of rights recognition. I think panels feel integrated rebuttals the rise of gig incentivize the companies to abuse workers' right. This is simply wrong. When the rise of gig exists, because exactly the push of capitalism industries tries to dehumanize worker in the very first place. I think when social movement exists, it is because how these people would actually how these companies, high social companies would actually pushes these workers towards fullest labor. I think hard labor would actually overworks them more than the gigs that they've chosen themselves, I think, right? Even if these this gigs actually would yeah would less incentivize those social welfare in the very first place coming from the companies, right? I think it is solely our trade-off. I think it does not can cover all of the amenities that these people need. So yeah, so I think on to like the weighing in, what is our team's contribution onto the possibility of coexisting 9 to 5 jobs? I think, right, comparison when those demand to opposite when those demand are too high, when the possibility of coexisting 9 to 5 job is very, very high because people think that it is a stability that is permanent and it can cater to all of these people needs that they can sustain themselves. For example, they can get pension, for instance, right? And also how these people can cater maternal leaves and etc., that the CJ and OG mentioned. I think CG already mentioned that it's privilege exactly because of that, the distinction of our case, because of that, people would think that it is going to be a requirement to have this job in the very first place. To land this job is a privilege, hence why CO says that it is going to be a lot much pressure than what gigs are going to offer them, right? I think when CEO already mentioned how niche this subject is going to be, how the information is going to be widespread, and it is going to like slowly be very rampant in the very first place. These people, this competitiveness would actually be a uniqueness requirement. I think to which this competitiveness would actually cannot compare to all of the thousands of
Yeah.
applications for some 9 to 5 jobs in corporations. These gigs are already won by themselves, right? The rise in itself, it is truly essential. Taking your prize.
Your argument about like community protections won't matter insofar as like the economy are not being taken seriously. Like what's your point against like our case?
Yeah, exactly. The community protection that we provided to you is because these people actually have that point where they start to think that these people are also my community because they come from the same background or like they have the same information, they have the same access to the sources, right? I think to which we can say to you that this community would actually gather and care about each other because exactly these companies in the very first place just abuse their worker, and these social welfare that you've said is just a tokenism for them to look good in front of this in front of the status quo. I think to which this community that is created by these people who want to have a side gig because they want to provide for themselves or want to sustain themselves fully is because the independency that they thought it's going to have a more sense of community that they created. They're going to build some sense of we are we are coming from the same group, which is we have to compete in a very monstrous a job applications world. And I think that is a few contributions to our case also. But how this manifestations of recruitment is going to be very rampant in the very first place, so people can have more opportunity, right? I think the potential already being catered by how this informations and all of that already said. I think how this exploring and also how this individual will eventually realize that they that themselves are not limited to the 9 to 5 jobs is going to be a new flexibility for them to, just strive later on and realize that the diversifications of work is not just limited to their parents or tiger parenting, demanding them to be a doctor, for instance. I think to which they can say to you, even if my gig requires me to work a lot harder, well, at least it is their preferences anyway, and it is not a demand, or this is not something that is pressured by you per se. I think also how we can also like create a sense of, I am not going to force my children into this. I think the normalization would be a very prominent case, since people are going to finally realize that we can also get there, and like searching jobs, because there's so much things to do besides just working 9 to 5 and like in front of computer. So proud to oppose. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that speech, Opposition Whip. So that marks the end of the exhibition debate. Yay. Thank you so much, everyone, and hope to see you in November 2025. Siska, boleh dimatiin recordingnya.